Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 12th episode of The Greats of History, the podcast where we get to know people with the epithet of the Great and try to get past the honorific and understand who they were, what they did, and why some people seem to like them so much. I am grateful that you are here. Last time, we got to know Darius I, who took the mantle from Cyrus the Great and grew the Achaemenid Persian Empire to its apex. Today, we will meet, I think, the most famous person in this entire series, Alexander the Great. So, that's a big claim. The most famous person? Well, yeah. No one in this series has enjoyed more fame in the grand sweep of human history than Alexander the Great. Kings and commanders alike fought with one another for millennia to try to rank as his equal. People called themselves the new Alexander and looked for ways to elevate themselves by simple association. One Roman commander, Pompey the Great, and yes, we will get to know him a bit down the line, marched in triumph through the streets of Rome wearing Alexander's cloak nearly 3 centuries after the great general's death. Another Roman, Augustus, the first emperor, ordered Alexander's tomb opened so he could commune with the spirit of the great Macedonian. Alexander placed a gold wreath on the long-dead Alex's head and scattered the body with flower petals. He was so enthralled by Alexander's corpse that he touched and broke off Alexander's nose. Roman emperors kept coming back for 2.5 centuries, leaving gifts and taking with them great awe and reverence. To connect with Alexander through clothing, gifts, funerary embellishments, titles, whatever, was to associate yourself with the greatest conqueror of the ancient world. I could go on, but this is the guy that everyone wanted to be. So many words have been written, so much ink has been spilled about Alexander the Great. Given all of this episode is kind of my Mount Everest. I'm either going to reach the summit or die trying. It's a new experience for me to be intimidated by someone who has been dead for 2.5 millennia. But how can I possibly do justice to the life and career of Alexander the Great? Alexander the freaking Great. But I have been surprised a few times in this series. I ended up liking some people more than I thought I would after having done their episodes, specifically Darius I and Ramses II. I don't come to this episode with any preconceived notions about whether or not Alex earned his epithet. Mind you, I've read a lot about this guy, but have never really contemplated whether or not he really lives up to the hype. Was he the greatest of the greats, the goat of goats? Well, I suppose we'd better find out. But goodness, where do we start? This is a tricky topic. There's a lot to say about Alexander, and like some of our previous episodes, Alexander was the beneficiary of a supremely talented father who paved the way for his son. There would have been no Alexander without Philip. You hear that, world? Philips are very important. And maybe I'm just a bit biased, but I think we need to spend some time with Philip. Most of this particular episode will be about Alexander's pops, but don't worry, we will get to Alex soon enough and in the course of this episode. People often think of Alexander as Greek. He was Greek-ish. So, like the previous episodes in this series, we're going to have to welcome onto the stage a new people, the Macedonians. We met them briefly in part 2 of Darius I. You may remember them from such historical events as collaborate with Persia and give Darius a beachhead in the Balkans. They are about to leap into the center of the narrative, so we need to know a bit more about the Macedonians. But before we do, let's check in with events from where we left off in the last episode, because Alexander and the Persians are going to have an epic clash. But this brief catch-up from prior episodes will be quick. In the last episode, we spent some time with Persia. Darius I, or Darius the Great, had just died, leaving his planned invasion of Greece to his successors. His son, Xerxes, took the throne and carried out the invasions, both as an act of devotion to his late great father and as an attempt to continue the Achaemenid legacy of conquest. After all, as we have seen time and again in this series, it was martial glory that did more than anything else to legitimize a new ruler in the hearts and minds of his subjects. Despite the portrayal of the Battle of Thermopylae as an epic martial feat, one in which the Spartan king Leonidas and 300 companions stood up to 1 million Persian soldiers, this battle was a strategic and tactical defeat for the Greeks. The last stand of the Spartan king cost him and his picked soldiers their lives and cost Xerxes a mere couple days. From Thermopylae, the Persians marched on, then sacked and burned Athens to the ground. The Persians were, for sure, eventually repulsed by land and sea at the battles of Plataea and Salamis. At Plataea, the supremely talented Persian general Mardonius, nephew of Darius and cousin to Xerxes, died, and the Persian invasion sputtered out. Despite having some willing collaborators within the Greek world, the Persians never subjugated Greece, but the tensions between the two civilizations would simmer for a long time to come. The war is often portrayed as a resounding victory for the Greeks. Once again, it's worth noting that the histories of this time period come down to us are almost exclusively written by the Greeks, so the narratives tend to be a bit skewed in their favor, both by exalting the Greek heroism and through the ongoing xenophobic demonization of the Persians. But from a Persian perspective, the Greek war was a mild annoyance, an elephant dealing with a buzzing fly. They still have the biggest darned empire the world has ever seen. The whole Greek thing wasn't nearly as big a deal to them as it was to the Greeks. It was a conflict at the fringes of their vast territory. The core of their empire remained. They were the dominant superpower of the world. And, not for nothing, and despite his reputation in Western culture as an arrogant, bumbling autocrat, Xerxes is remembered by many scholars of Persian history as a wise and accomplished king of kings. We met Cyrus the Great. We met Darius the Great. I don't want to get too carried away with making this series the Greats of Persia, but Xerxes I is often called Xerxes the Great. He was an effective administrator. He just didn't happen to conquer Greece. Eventually, after 20 years on the throne, he was assassinated by a scheming court retainer and then succeeded by his son, Artaxerxes, who ruled for more than 3 decades. I know I said it in the prior episode, so I'll say it only one more time. The Persians brought about one of the truly great cosmopolitan civilizations in all of human history, and even though they suffered the scorn of the Greek historians, they deserve our respect and admiration. The Greeks and Persians squabbled with each other over the course of the decades following Plataea and Salamis, with the Greeks generally getting the better end of things. But the Greeks can't get too cozy because a new threat would soon emerge, much closer to home, and this time the results will be very different. So let's just keep that in the back of the mind as we leave the Persians to themselves for a little bit and shift our focus back to the Macedonians. Macedonia was an ancient kingdom on the Balkan Peninsula, north of Greece and south and west of the rugged region of Thrace. Like almost every civilization of the ancient world, the Macedonians developed their own mythic origin story and traced their ancestry back to the legendary warrior Temenus, who, according to Greek mythology, was a great-great-grandson of Hercules. According to the legends, Temenus conquered and became king of the city of Argos in the Peloponnese, the peninsula in southern Greece that's also home to another mythic warrior people, the Spartans. When Temenus was assassinated, his 3 sons fled north, and after casting about for a new homeland, founded a new kingdom and a new ruling dynasty. Thus the Argead dynasty of Macedonia, from their roots in Argos, was born, sometime in the 7th century BCE. Now, to be sure, this story is full of myth, wishful thinking, and imagination, but it tells us a few things. The first is that the Macedonians viewed themselves as descended from the greatest warrior, Hercules, ever to walk the earth. I know, he's a myth, but only to us. To the people of the ancient world, Hercules was a real forefather, some towering figure from an heroic age whose epic feats and unrivaled strength overawed all the people that followed. Legend or not, he had a legacy. Another thing we can draw from the Macedonian origin story is that they saw their roots as Greek. They came from the Peloponnese. Their ancestors ruled Argos, an important Greek city-state. Even though their more urbane and decidedly snobbish cousins made fun of their rustic accents, the Macedonians spoke Greek, or at least the regional dialect of it. They worshipped the gods and goddesses of the Greek pantheon. They participated in Greek cultural heritage. So, while geographically removed from mainland Greece, the Macedonians were deeply Hellenic. But that doesn't mean that they were accepted or treated as equals by the Greeks themselves. For just a little south, those snobby Greeks, especially the Athenians with their philosophers and their playwrights and their democracy, they looked down at the Macedonians as barbarians and turned their noses at their uncouth neighbors up north. Regardless, the Argeads, that ruling family that traced their lineage both through Hercules and the city-state of Argos, definitely had some big plans now that they were in charge up in Macedonia. Starting in about 700 BCE, the Argeads slowly pushed their boundaries outward. As we saw in the prior episodes about the origins of the Persians, Macedonia didn't start as a kingdom or an empire, but rather as an assemblage of tribes loosely organized by a common culture. The Argeads thus sought to consolidate political power across these groups and to build a centralized leadership structure. For the Argeads, it wasn't a smooth ascent from a tribal kingdom to a powerful empire. They had their fair share of civil wars, dynastic struggles, and regional conflicts that gave the world no indication that, in time, Macedonia would be the seat of power, not only for the Greek world, but also for the entire world. When Darius and Xerxes made their forays into Europe, Macedonia was caught in between the Persians and their targeted Greek adversaries. Neutrality wasn't really an option. On one hand, they had more culturally in common with the Greeks, but the Greeks were snobs, generally patronizing towards the Macedonians, and besides, the Persians were the dominant superpower of the day. Faced with the choice between these two sides, Macedonia allied itself with Persia, placing their bet on the King of Kings and avoiding the sure annihilation that would have come by attempting to stand in the way. Macedonian soldiers fought alongside the Persians and against Greece. When the Greeks prevailed, the resentment and distrust they felt for their Macedonian neighbors only grew. When Xerxes left town, the Greeks could breathe a sigh of relief. The Argeads lost a strategic ally, but they were still in charge of their own territory. But their territory was a bit of a mess. Much of that was of their own making. By the early 4th century BCE, the Argeads had built Macedonia into a regional power, but one of relatively minor consequence. A petty kingdom in an area and in an age with lots of petty kingdoms. The royal family had been enduring cataclysmic violence, with different branches of the family attempting to slaughter the others in order to gain power. Macedonian kings were polygamous and generally prolific. They had less of a family tree and more of a twisting, winding, intertwined family vine. Purges, coups, regicide, infanticide, fratricide, all kinds of killings were on the table, and no one was ever safe. There was bloodshed, betrayal, and chaos. To compound matters, the Argead Macedonians occasionally stopped trying to kill each other long enough to get the kingdom embroiled in all sorts of wars, rivalries, and petty conflicts with neighboring kingdoms and city-states. In essence, they were constantly at war with themselves and with others. While its kings got into and out of various scrapes and alliances, the Athenians and Spartans, the most famous city-states from ancient Greece, were near the apex of their power and cultural influence. All the more reason for them to look down upon the bloody chaos raging above them. In 382 BCE, the Macedonian king Amyntas III welcomed a baby boy to his family. The little prince, with the downright handsome name of Philip, was the youngest child in a family that included 2 older brothers and an older sister. Philip was born into a troubled time for Macedonia. This isn't really a history of Macedonia, so I'll just give a few important details, but needless to say, the rivalries, feuds, alliances, and betrayals that define the Macedonian world made sitting on the throne a very tenuous position. Amyntas III was Macedonia's 5th king in 6 years, and his predecessors did not die pleasant, peaceful deaths. Someone was always hiding around the corner with a sharp instrument. Unlike many of his predecessors, however, Amyntas III was not a violent thug. Once he got control of the kingdom, he used diplomacy to strengthen his position, forming alliances with other aspiring regional powers to shore up its foundations. He fought wars, as any such king did, but he usually did so as part of an alliance or partnership, and he cemented ties with other kingdoms in the area. This strategy of not going into war alone meant that any setback in the war was not an existential crisis to the kingdom. And maybe the Argeads were tired of liquidating each other at every turn, or maybe everyone else was already dead, but Amyntas managed to hold on to the Argead crown for more than 2 decades. While still living in a violent and tumultuous era, he nevertheless did a lot to stabilize the kingdom and the fortunes of his family. He lived to the unusually ripe old age, for Argead kings at least, of 50. Upon his death in 370 BCE, Amyntas's oldest son, Alexander II, nope, not that Alexander, took over. Alex II inherited the crown at about age 19 and was fated to rule for 3 short, chaotic, violent years. There was always a fight, always a crisis. He careened about, trying to put out fires everywhere, facing threats from within his kingdom and without. Suffice to say, he didn't succeed. He got knifed in 368 BCE, and the next brother in line, Perdiccas III, took his turn in charge. Around this time, the youngest brother from the royal family, Philip, was sent to live as a hostage in the powerful Greek city of Thebes. Hostage-taking was a long-established tool to prevent war. Handing over your family to the possession of an enemy was supposed to ensure good behavior. We've seen it throughout this series, even back to the Thutmose III episodes when he deployed the strategy. But being hostage in a foreign land was not a gloomy, dire imprisonment. Philip thrived as a Theban captive. There were worse places to be sent for a young royal of great promise. We don't have time to get too deep into it, but Thebes is totally overlooked and underrated as a Greek city-state. At times, it was the most powerful in all of Greece, even above its more famous contemporaries, Athens, Sparta, and Corinth. Like many such polities, its fortunes rose and fell over the centuries. But Thebes was a major player, and it had all of the elements of Greek culture we think of: artists, philosophers, teachers, poets, playwrights, statesmen, the works. The renowned Pindar, considered by some to be the greatest poet in Greece's long tradition of great poets, hailed from Thebes. Thebes had a lot to offer a bright young prince, and Philip was certainly that. He soaked up every bit of knowledge his restless and prodigious brain could handle. He studied warfare, ethics, diplomacy, strategy, and tactics under the great Theban generals Epaminondas and Pamenes. Epaminondas, in particular, was an important tutor. While his name is barely known, he was considered for centuries to be the greatest Greek of his time, a man of diplomatic brilliance and martial valor. And he, like many Thebans, taught Philip all the tools of the trade. For 4 years, Philip apprenticed at the sides of the great Theban leaders of the day. When he returned to Macedonia in or around 364 BCE, Philip brought with him a head full of ideas. He got a chance to put them to use a few short years later. For once, his predecessor wasn't assassinated, but this time, older brother Perdiccas III died in battle, fighting the dreaded and savage Illyrians. With his older brothers dead, the third of Amyntas III's son took the throne. Prince Philip became King Philip II of Macedon. And boy, did he have a lot of work ahead of him. For starters, he had to toss aside the guy that had actually been named as the successor. Perdiccas had named his son, Amyntas IV, as the intended heir to the throne. Uncle Phil was supposed to be the regent and tutor to the fresh prince, but when Perdiccas died, Philip swept the young king aside and took the throne for himself. He didn't kill young Amyntas IV, though. Eventually, he wed one of his own daughters to his nephew. Little could he know that by doing so, Philip was actually sealing the princeling's fate. More on that to come. No matter the questionable legitimacy that put him on the throne, Philip II was king of Macedonia. Like many of his predecessors, he faced crises everywhere, but he ascended to the throne with something many of them had never been afforded: an apprenticeship in ruling, and the benefit of a well-rounded and comprehensive education which Philip had gotten during his time as a hostage in Thebes. At every turn there was violent chaos. To the west, the Illyrians, the unruly tribe that had just killed his brother, were on the rampage. To the north and east, the savage Paeonian and Thracian tribes were invading Macedonian territory. And a bit further south, the meddlesome Athenians set sail for Macedonia with the aim of capitalizing on all this instability and installing their own pliant king on the throne. In every direction, there was a decidedly hostile tribe or a polity hell-bent on destroying Macedonia and its new and unproven king. And, as always, there's always someone disgruntled or grasping, some family member willing to off the king in their own bid for power. Philip responded with both brute strength and timely diplomacy. Not wanting to be spread too thin, Philip bought off the Paeonians and the Thracians with promises of tribute payment, and then concentrated his forces on the Athenians, judging them to be the most severe threat. Routing their detachment of 3,000 troops, he sent them sailing home in humiliation. He had bought just a little bit of breathing room, and he immediately resolved to put it to full effect. Philip got to work consolidating his position at home and prepping for all the chaos he knew would soon come crashing down. Chaos always came crashing down. His first order of business was to shore up his army. First on the to-do list was to deal with those wild and unpredictable Illyrians. Illyria was the untamed region on the northwest Balkan peninsula, roughly in the neighborhood of modern Albania. It had been inhabited by a culturally distinct people since at least the 10th century BCE. The Illyrians had a reputation throughout the ancient times as unpredictable and as positively bellicose. They brought trouble with them wherever they went. In their recent showdown with the Argeads, the Illyrians hadn't just killed Philip's older brother, they had utterly obliterated Macedonia's army. With grim determination, Philip set about bolstering his country's shattered military. He raised new troops and bolstered the ranks of both his foot soldiers and his cavalry. Now, the standard Greek or Macedonian infantry unit was called a phalanx. Around this time, the Hellenic phalanxes were usually 8 soldiers across and about the same number deep. Philip's tutor, Epaminondas, had favored larger units, and perhaps with his lessons in mind, Philip doubled the width and depth of the core fighting unit by expanding the Macedonian phalanx to 16 across and 16 deep. This brought the fighting force of a unit up from 64 to 256 heavily armed soldiers. Philip took the standard Greek shield used by all the Hellenic kingdoms and shrunk it, and considerably, to a roughly 24 inches around. This shield was strapped to the left arm and shoulder to free up the hands of his soldiers, which they would definitely need because Philip then introduced a very unique weapon, the sarissa. The sarissa was essentially a long spear, a really, really long spear, as long as 20 feet long. It weighed up to 14 pounds, including a counterweight at the back for balance. This might at first seem like a strange and unwieldy thing to carry into battle, but the Sarissa gave the Macedonians a considerable advantage. In an age when most battles were fought at arm's length, the length of the Sarissa allowed the Macedonians to strike further, reaching the enemy before the enemy could reach them. The long spears could decimate an enemy before the enemy even reached the Macedonians. Armed with relatively short swords, only the first row, or maybe two, of a typical Greek phalanx could engage in combat. The extended length of the Sarissa allowed more troops in the back rows to strike, as many as 5 rows deep, able to engage with 16 rows wide and up to 5 rows deep. A Macedonian phalanx could thrust 80 razor-sharp spear tips on the front lines of an enemy unit, and they could do so from a greater distance, keeping their soldiers safer for longer. If their adversaries could get past this maze of iron and get through to the Macedonian lines, their comrades a few rows back could offer an iron-tipped welcome to the enemy, and should the guys up front tire or get injured, the length of the Sarissas gave cover to the soldiers that needed to peel back from their front line, helping ensure the Macedonians minimized battlefield casualties. When one man fell from the front ranks from fatigue, injury, or death, everyone simply stepped up one row and just kept fighting. Should an enemy decide to send their cavalry crashing into the Macedonian ranks, the Sarissa could make them pay for any such rash impudence. Each spear had a spiked butt at the end, so the Macedonian soldiers could bury the spike into the ground and brace themselves and let the enemies and their horses impale themselves on the deadly wall of spear tips. And should the enemy try to halt the Macedonians through volleys of arrows, the troops could align their Sarissas into a sort of wooden wall covering the phalanx, offering another use of the innovative weapon. A Macedonian phalanx, with a full complement of Sarissa-wielding soldiers, looked like a very ornery porcupine. One opposing commander described the sight as the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. This innovation gave the Macedonians a huge advantage. They brought into a conflict a wholly unique weapon and carefully developed tactics to maximize its effect. You might ask then, if these long spears were so great, how come everyone didn't use them? Well, the Sarissas were unlike any weapon in the ancient world. They may have changed the battlefield dynamics, but troops couldn't just put down their old stuff, pick up the new Sarissas, and expect good results. The Sarissa required troops to train, and Philip loved to train his soldiers. How to advance as a unit, how to close rank, how to thrust and stab, how to cover your comrade, how to march in lockstep, how to brace for a cavalry assault, close ranks, fill in a gap, cover against the flight of incoming arrows. Anything the phalanx might encounter on the battlefield. Philip wanted his troops to be unfazed by the fog of war. The Macedonians practiced using the new weapons and with Philip's tactics, over and over and over, relentlessly. No one else had the Sarissa. No one else trained harder to prepare for war. Philip also overhauled his cavalry, likewise upgrading the horse soldiers on tactics and discipline. Just like with his foot soldiers, he relentlessly trained his cavalry to make sure that they could move with lightning speed and overwhelming force. Not all battles are easily concluded. Not all outcomes are determined on the battlefield. As we've seen throughout the series, sometimes an army had to settle into a long siege to conquer an enemy hunkered down behind city walls. These, as we've discussed in prior episodes, can be particularly problematic. Disease had a way to spread throughout army encampments, and the longer a siege lasted, the greater the chances of such a disaster, even when the besiegers outnumbered those inside a city by a considerable margin. The best way to defeat a siege was by preventing one through a smashing victory. The next best way was to break a siege and do it fast. In his overhaul of the Macedonian army, Philip thought of this too. Philip introduced enhanced siege engines and battering rams. He devised new ways to get over walls quickly, to attack defenders inside a city, and to knock down the gates barred against him. He could overwhelm an enemy city with speed and force. Philip had a relentless attention to detail. Nothing escaped his watchful eye. Whether they encountered an enemy on the field or walled up behind a city, the Macedonians were ready for it all, but the world was not ready for the Macedonians. The first time Philip took his new toys out to play was to challenge the Illyrians. Philip had a score to settle. These wild warriors had killed his brother, invaded Macedonian territory, and claimed a part of Philip's kingdom as their own. His new troops, with new weapons and new tactics, were all, well, new. All of his planning made sense in theory, but how would they hold up against a disciplined and battle-tested adversary? When they squared up, the Macedonians more than held their own. The first major battle of Philip's Illyrian campaign happened in 358 BCE. It was a hard-fought contest, but eventually Philip's troops carried the day, and they routed the Illyrians, killing 7,000 of the warriors. Philip reclaimed his lost territory, chastened the Illyrians, and sent a signal to anyone paying attention that there was a new sheriff in town. For good measure, he even married an Illyrian princess, the first of his many marriages. I'll steal yo honey like I stole yo bike. Then he married again. This time, the bride was from a remote region of Upper Macedonia that had stayed out of the hands of the Argead family. Through marriage, he extended his sphere of influence, projecting his power even further. He followed his second marriage by marrying another princess from Thessaly, the untamed region to the south of his kingdom. In about 2 years, Philip secured for himself 4 or 5 wives, each of whom helped strengthen the diplomatic ties to his kingdoms on his periphery. If you will recall, at the outset of his reign, Macedonia was beset on all sides by violence and unrest. Certainly, he had chastened the Illyrians, driven them out of Macedonia, and taken back his territory, but it was mostly through these marriages, not his new phalanx, that Philip extended his control. Since this strategy was working so well, in 357 BCE he married again. This time the princess was named Olympias. She was from the Molossian tribe, a group from the kingdom of Epirus, west of Macedonia and south of Illyria. If you've lost track, this is either Philip's fourth or fifth wife, depending on the chronology. But this one matters a lot to us because in 356 BCE she gave birth to a precocious prince who will loom large in our story shortly. Unlike, say, an Egyptian or a Persian version of royal polygamy, the Macedonians did not recognize a hierarchy among the royal wives. All sons were potential heirs, and competition to place a son on the throne was fierce. This is in part why the Argead spent so much time killing one another. No succession was inherently predetermined, so there was an incentive to make a bid for power. Philip would eventually have 7 wives, but perhaps surprisingly only fathered 7 children. Maybe he had so few kids, relatively speaking, because most of his marriages were political in nature. Or maybe it's because Philip was never at home. Rather, he was out, fighting, campaigning, feuding, and usually winning. If the idea of so many wives is a bit arresting for what we think of when considering the Hellenic world, consider that in the way that he set up his royal household and administration, Philip wasn't actually emulating the Greeks. Rather, he looked to a Achaemenid Persian model for kingship for inspiration. Many of the innovations that Philip introduced were drawn from established practices in the rival kingdom to the east. Despite his Hellenic upbringing and cultural alignment, Philip was pragmatic enough to see that some Persian administrative techniques had great merit. These included the appointment of royal pages and of royal companions, the establishment of a secretariat, and founding imperial archives. He set his wives up in a style similar to the Persian harem. He even drank from a Persian-style cup, sat on a Persian-style throne, and rode a horse with Persian-style equipment. Philip didn't let the conventions of the Greek world define his approach to kingship. He brought his own distinct flair to a Hellenic kingdom. In Philip, we find an amalgamation of 2 great cultures. At this point, it might be helpful to summarize the next few years of Philip's career rather than get too deep into the details. His primary goal was always to strengthen and enlarge his kingdom. Through the course of the 350s BCE, Philip fought a series of successful campaigns that pushed his power outward in all directions. Among other things, this brought Philip further into conflict with Athens, which had a series of satellite cities too close for Philip's comfort. Through diplomatic alliances with cities that shared Athens as a common enemy, or through direct military confrontation, Philip chased the Athenians out of his neighborhood. Unable to get the better of their uncouth northern neighbor, the Athenians seethed. All these victories came at a price for Philip personally. Despite the influences of the Persians, Philip and the Macedonians had more in common culturally with the Greeks, and he, like many Hellenic kings of his day, led his troops, not from the safety of the rear as a Persian might, but right up front, in the center of his battle formations. With each encounter, petty skirmish, or full-scale war, Philip put himself right in the middle, his life on the line, and while he never fell in battle, he did suffer a lot of dire injuries, including losing his right eye as a result of a wound sustained in one of his scuffles with Athenian forces. In other fights, he suffered stab wounds, a broken collarbone, and a vicious leg injury that eventually left him with a pronounced limp. But Philip was a tough dude, and he never let any injury stop him from strapping his shield to his left arm, picking up his sarissa, and marching dead on at his enemies. And fight he did. The nature of Hellenic culture made a big, one-fell-swoop conquest exceedingly difficult. Each polis, or city-state, had its own rules, regulations, governance, treaty, partnerships, colonies, militaries, etc. These city-states shifted alliances, were variously subjected to, or were dominant over others. The political landscape in Greece was always fluid, or probably better said, chaotic. Conquest in this part of the world was a one by one at a time project, and it took considerable time to consolidate power. Remember, when Philip became king of Macedonia, the kingdom and the region in which it sat was highly fractured and unstable. It took Philip years of campaigning to consolidate the power within his kingdom and to slowly reduce the surrounding territories. From the 350s BCE and into the 340s BCE, year after bloody year, Philip just kept fighting. Usually he won, rarely, but occasionally he lost. As each year bled into the next, he became a force to be reckoned with. And in case anyone forgot the name of the one-eyed badass reshaping the landscape of the Hellenic world, Philip put his name on the map. Literally. Over the course of his rule, he started a tradition that his son would take to absurd extremes, naming cities after himself. The challenge in looking at the career of Philip II in a podcast like this is that there are a million rabbit holes. We could go deep down any one of them, and it would be interesting. But unfortunately for Philip, and I guess for me, he's going to be seriously overshadowed in a few years, and he's just here to show us around the place. So, some of these descriptions are a bit oversimplified. Other important historical details are getting left out entirely. If you want to know more about Philip, or Alexander for that matter, then drop me a line, and I can recommend a book or two to go deeper. But for now, let's just say that Philip's conquest eventually radiated outward and into mainland Greece. Given the ever-shifting nature of political alliances, this brought Macedonia deeper into the chaos of the Greek world. Macedonia was more powerful than any one city, but when some cities joined forces, they could be a stern match for the one-eyed Argead warlord. One of these topics that could chew up a lot of time, and one which we'll have to simply skim past, was the conflict that really catapulted Philip and Macedonia to the top of the Greek political landscape. Fought between 356 BCE, the same year his son Alexander was born, and 346 BCE, the Third Sacred War eventually brought peace to Greece, with Philip emerging as the most powerful player in the Hellenic world. But Philip didn't initially enter this contest as one of the prime belligerents. Rather, his old ally Thebes got into a scrape with another regional power over the usage of some sacred land for agricultural cultivation. Their feud eventually drew most of the major Greek players into a swirling vortex of conflict. With the Greek cities distracted by their feuds, Philip took the opportunity to extend his power across northern Greece, including the territory of Thessaly. As the conflict dragged on, the Greek cities grew increasingly exhausted, thus Philip's power was dramatically expanding as that of the Greek city-states was teetering. When Philip entered the conflict, he was in the strongest position relative to everyone else. Once involved, one of the adversaries that Philip fought against in the sprawling wars was Athens. In 351 BCE, amidst all the fighting and maneuvering, Demosthenes, a rising star in Athenian politics, rose up to stir his countrymen to a stronger resistance to the surging Macedonian tide. This silver-tongued politician was full of patronizing contempt for Philip, and for that matter, anyone that wasn't fortunate enough to be Athenian. In an attempt to rally the flagging spirits of his countrymen, he unleashed his signature brand of xenophobic vitriol on Philip. Simultaneously trashing Philip and exalting the Athenians to greater courage, Demosthenes called Philip a barbarian, an arrogant, uncultured swine. Philip, said Demosthenes, had become, quote, intoxicated with the magnitude of his exploits, close quote. Philip wasn't great. He wasn't strong or powerful or even worthy of respect. No, Demosthenes declared, the issue was that Athens had grown soft. Philip wasn't winning as much as Athens was beating themselves. Stand up, fight back, and let the natural superiority of Athens put the uppity savage in his place. This speech, the first in a series of rambling screeds that history refers to as the Philippics, just went on and on. In his character assassination of Philip, Demosthenes got ugly, but Philip got even. By 346 BCE, and despite the rhetoric of the stirring orator, Philip had firmly and decisively come out on top in the Third Sacred War. Realizing that words were not nearly as effective as sarissas in winning battles, the Athenians sent a delegation to Philip to beg for peace. Among their ambassadors was Demosthenes, who Philip received graciously. The haughty Demosthenes would not exactly return the favor. He helped negotiate a peace treaty, then skulked back to Athens to nurse his wounded ego. When Philip emerged victorious, he was in a strong position to dictate terms of peace, not just between Athens and Macedonia, but across the Greek world. The Third Sacred War was the conflict that vaulted Philip to the top of the heap. By the time the decade-long war finally concluded in 346 BCE, Philip had emerged as the most powerful ruler in the Hellenic world. Sometime over the course of this war, disaffected members of the Persian nobility began drifting their way into Philip's court. Unlike his Greek cousins, Macedonia had a generally fruitful relationship with, if not all of Persia, then at least some notable Persians. You may recall that Macedonian troops fought beside, not against, the invading army of Xerxes the Great. Some of the Persian nobles that made it to Philip were pretenders, others were exiles. Philip, always eager to learn everything he could, to gain as much insight into the minds and ideas of others, peppered his guests with questions. He heard what they had to say. He learned a lot about the inner workings of the Persian Empire, its politics, its rivalries, the tensions at court. With all this fresh intelligence, Philip drew a picture of its king, then Artaxerxes III, as someone that might need to be knocked down a peg or two. While the king sat down for these discussions, his young son, Alexander, listened in. Philip gave support to some of these pretenders, encouraged them to make their own plays for power. He delighted in the opportunity to stir up chaos in the mighty empire to his east. Despite Demosthenes' characterization of Philip as a savage barbarian, the Argead king was clearly of uncommon intelligence. He understood more than brute force. He had a subtle and strategic mind, and he was able to calculate risk and opportunities, to gather information and make informed decisions. As he engaged the Persian nobles in conversation, he kept drawing out more and more information, more data points to analyze, and all the while, Philip's young son listened and learned. As I'm sure you've gathered, it's this young boy, Philip's young son, Alexander, that we're going to spend a lot of time getting to know. But who was this kid? What set him apart as someone to keep an eye on? Alexander, as you will recall, was born to Olympias, the fourth wife of Philip, whom he had wed in 357 BCE. She had given birth to Alexander the next year, and it was clear that he had been charmed by the gods from his very first day on Earth. Or at least, so went the legends. On Alexander's birthday, in July 356 BCE, at the Macedonian royal palace in the capital of Pella, the ancient wonder of the world, the temple of Artemis at Ephesus, burned down. According to later legends, the goddess was too preoccupied with celebrating Alexander's earthly arrival to protect her own home. But the good omens didn't just stop there. On that very same day, allegedly, Philip's leading general won a smashing battlefield victory. And if that wasn't enough, right around the same time as these other fortuitous events, the king's prize racehorse won a race in the Olympic Games. In honor of the achievement, he renamed the horse Olympias to pay homage to his Epirot bride. One crazy legend, later cultivated by Alexander himself, was that Philip wasn't even really his father. Rather, the god Zeus took the form of a serpent and then impregnated the queen Olympias. Having Philip for a dad was cool, but having the chief god of the Greek pantheon was much, much cooler. Whether he was born of Zeus or not, and call me skeptical on that one, I think Philip was a pretty good guy to have looking after Alexander's development. Father took great care to make sure his son was surrounded by the best teachers, mentors, and companions. Perhaps self-conscious of their rough-and-tumble reputation, Macedonian nobles received a sophisticated classical education. Raised on epics like the Iliad and the Odyssey, they were imbued with the heroic warrior ethic from an early age. These legends fired Alexander's ambitions. He yearned to be remembered as an all-time great alongside the legendary Greek heroes like Achilles, Odysseus, Menelaus, and Ajax. As he grew up in the royal palace, the young prince's ambition was plain for all to see. He burned to do great things. His mother, Olympias, far from calming things down, stoked the flames, telling her son that he was destined to rule and that he was of divine origin. Like their Persian counterparts, Alexander and his companions were trained to excel in the martial disciplines and to develop their physical skills. Horse riding, running, wrestling, swordsmanship, shooting a bow and arrow, all the things a future king would need to do to lead from the front. In addition to physical prowess, Alexander was encouraged to cultivate his mind, studying poetry, rhetoric, logic, even playing the lyre and singing. The precocious prince took to his lessons like a fish to water. He showed a deep and abiding intellect and a burning curiosity about the world and how it worked. The flame of his overactive mind burned bright, and it took considerable effort to keep it fed. His tutors and his companions struggled to keep up. Even at a time when attributes like strength and intelligence were deeply embellished to add luster to a young noble, it was plain for all to see that the young man was clearly brilliant. He carried with him the aura of future greatness. Around his time he was 13, two very important things happened in young Alexander's life. The first was that Philip thought it was time to upgrade the caliber of tutoring for his heir. The king cast about for the right person to help shape the moral and intellectual trajectory of his son. To be the tutor to the king's son was a position of enormous prestige and influence. Such a position would bring the tutor into the intimate circle of the king. But by cultivating the ethics, ideas, values, and behaviors of the heir apparent, a tutor would have the chance to change the entire trajectory of the Macedonian Empire and with it the whole Greek world. The right tutor mattered greatly for a number of reasons. After consideration, Philip chose for his son the brilliant philosopher and polymath Aristotle to lead Alexander's development. Pretty solid choice, if I do say so myself. Aristotle hailed from the city of Stagira, which had fallen on the wrong side of one of the wars that had ravaged the Greek world. In other words, it had opposed Philip, and the king had razed the city as a punishment. There were still some hurt feelings, and Aristotle took some convincing. In order to sweeten the offer he made to the philosopher, Philip rebuilt Stagira and took care to resettle its displaced population. Aristotle relented to the king's pleas. After all, you can only say no to Philip for so long, and he accepted the position as tutor to the brilliant young teenager. Aristotle set up shop in the city of Mieza, where Philip gave the philosopher a temple to use as a classroom. Philip also realized that in order to be set up to rule, his son would need to be surrounded by a cohort of well-trained and unquestionably loyal companions. To make sure that the sons of the leading Macedonian families could keep pace with Alexander, Philip sent youths such as Cassander, Ptolemy, Hephaestion, and others to accompany his son on his intellectual and moral apprenticeship. These companions would all have a profound impact on the life and career of Alexander for a long time, and even after his early death. The second formative event of Alexander's early teens demonstrated the boy's elevated, almost mythic consciousness. Stopping home in Pella for a break from one of his limitless campaigns, Philip had wanted a new war horse. The top horse breeder offered Philip what he deemed to be his best colt. The animal was magnificent, awe-inspiring. It was also huge and wild, bucking and fighting all attempts to bring him under control. To top it off, the breeder demanded an ungodly sum for his unrideable mount, hundreds of pounds of precious gold and silver. Philip rightly reasoned that it would do him no good to be thrown off the beast to his death, and he told the breeder to get lost. But Alex was enthralled by the animal, and he asked his father for the chance to tame the stallion. Should he succeed, the prince offered, the king would buy it for him. If Alexander failed, he would pay the sum himself. The kid must have had quite an allowance. Amused, Philip told his son to have at it. Alexander approached the horse slowly, putting his hand on its massive head and whispering in its ear. He then slowly moved the horse so it could no longer see its own shadow, which Alexander had understood to be the cause of the fear driving the animal's wild aggression. Alexander confidently mounted the now calmed horse, which was now his, having won it in the bet with his father. We don't know if Alexander named the horse or if it arrived already bearing its name. Either way, if Alexander would go down as antiquity's greatest warrior, then Bucephalus would unquestionably go down as antiquity's greatest war horse. The two shared a deep, almost spiritual bond. Alexander would mount Bucephalus and ride to glory. These were boom times for Philip. His son was on his way to a great physical and intellectual education, and his campaigns were all going swimmingly. Riding high though he may have been, two things emerged as thorns in Philip's side. The first, between 344 and 343 BCE, Demosthenes hit the road, taking his talents south, and east and west, and all around the Greek world. Embittered by Athens' humiliating defeat in the Third Sacred War, Demosthenes just kept spewing more venom about Philip in another of his oratorical screeds. Demosthenes was trying to stir up resentment and talk anyone who would listen to standing up to the Macedonian king. He kept going on and on about what a jerk Philip was, and in 341 BCE he delivered his third Philippic. He then delivered his fourth Philippic in 340 BCE, hitting his tired tropes of Athenian superiority and Macedonian barbarism and appeals to patriotism to throw off the yoke of the vile oppressors and blah, 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 blah. With each speech, his star rose just a little bit higher. The guy could really talk, and he riled up the Greeks. As he delivered his Philippics, Demosthenes became the preeminent political operative in Athens. The second issue that Philip had to contend with is that in 340 and 339 BCE, Philip attempted to conquer a couple more cities, including a siege of the city of Byzantium, the future Constantinople, Istanbul. Why he sieged it, we can't say. I guess Philip just liked it better that way. When Philip had left for this siege, he decided to leave his 16-year-old son behind and in charge of the kingdom. What better apprenticeship could be had than sitting in the palace and enjoying holding court? Well, Alexander was not one for such idle inaction. A tribe in one of the adjoining kingdoms noticed that Philip had left town and rose up in revolt. Not waiting for his dad, Alexander, again, he was only 16, organized the troops and led the putative expedition personally. His first campaign was a smashing success. He crushed the troublesome Madai tribe, reveling in his first taste of victory. He even named a city after himself, Alexandropolis. Spoiler alert, you should get used to Alexander winning battles and naming cities after himself because he would come to do both, and a lot. While Son was roaming around the countryside knocking around some Thracians, Philip was encamped with his army outside the eastern cities, including Byzantium. In an unusual defeat for the greedy king, the sieges failed. In this, some Greeks saw weaknesses and got ideas about stepping out from under Philip's shadow. Athens linked up with Thebes, the city in which Philip was once held hostage, and led a coalition in revolt against Macedonia. Now, all the way back in the introduction, I shared that I find the specific of battlefield tactics and flanks and feints kind of dull. If you want more details about what's about to happen, pause here and Google the Battle of Cannaria. For our purposes, what matters is that in 338 BCE, Philip obliterated the Athenian-Theban coalition, and his domination of Greece was total. When the day of the battle came, Philip, as he always did, led from the front, leading the Macedonian left. To lead the right side of the army, Philip placed his now 18-year-old son Alexander in command. Father and son led the Macedonians to a complete and total rout. Nothing was left to stop the Macedonians from overwhelming all of the Greek world. We could forgive Philip if he vented his fury on Athens and on Demosthenes. And yet, despite the prominent role that Athens and its silver-tongued orator had played in causing all the trouble, Philip was lenient with the city and with its politician, foregoing harsh terms in favor of a more measured and diplomatic settlement. Demosthenes had sold a vision of Athenian superiority and of Macedonian moral depravity. In the aftermath of Chaeronea, Philip's measured approach to Athens exposed Demosthenes' rhetoric as empty and baseless, at least as far as Athens was concerned. But Demosthenes, convinced of his innate superiority, just couldn't give Philip an ounce of credit or respect. Not everyone received such relative leniency from the Macedonian king. Perhaps feeling a bit of betrayal at the hands of his former host city, Philip punished Thebes harshly, including by installing a considerable garrison of Macedonian troops within the city. But by and large, Philip wanted to de-escalate the conflict. Following his stirring victory at Chaeronea, Philip traveled all over Greece, personally settling the disputes between Macedonia and all the various city-states. He was after alliances, not domination, and with deft skill, he negotiated resolutions to a number of complex issues. With the sole exception of Sparta, all the Greek cities recognized Philip as protector of the Hellenic world, and they all got together and voted him as the chief general to lead a combined effort to invade, and hopefully conquer, Persia. If there's one thing that promised to unite the entire Greek world behind a common cause, it was a campaign against their age-old foe, the Persians. In prior conflicts, the Persians had invaded Greece. Under the strong leadership and brilliant generalship of Philip, it would be time to return the favor. One eye, a bad leg, scarred from head to toe, the tough, rugged Philip began preparing for the campaign that would be the capstone to a remarkable career. The idea was to start in Asia Minor and to liberate the Ionian Greek cities on the fringes of the Persian Empire. If you remember back in the Darius episodes, these were the cities that had rebelled against Persia and triggered the Persian invasions of Darius and Xerxes back in the early decades of the 400s BCE. Philip's Persian strategy was informed by the intel he had gathered from all the disaffected nobles that had sought refuge in his court. Putting all this intelligence to use, he devised a plan, and Philip sent several of his most senior commanders ahead with an army of about 10,000 soldiers to get things started, including a key general named Attalus. They made rapid progress, and the Ionian Greek cities welcomed their liberation. The Macedonian effort to overthrow Persia was underway, and the two great civilizations were at war again, and Philip geared up to head over to Asia to take command. But first, he had some family business to attend to. It was time to party, to celebrate. His daughter, Cleopatra, was getting hitched. I mean, I'm sure you know this, but no, not that Cleopatra. But it was an important family name, and in a few hundred years, we will definitely get to know another Cleopatra. For Olympias, the mother of both Alexander and of the blushing bride Cleopatra, this was not a joyous occasion. Olympias wasn't there. She was far away, pouting, and maybe plotting? By this time in 336 BCE, Olympias was in self-imposed exile. She had grown estranged from her husband because of what seems to have been a not-so-healthy combination of her burning ambition for her son and Philip's tempestuous personality. Olympias had stopped at nothing to advance the fortunes of her son, and, talented though Alexander may have been, her relentless maneuvering had worn Philip's patience thin. A year or so earlier, Philip had done something new. He got married. Well, to be more precise, what made this particular marriage a bit different was that Philip decided to marry a young woman of Macedonian nobility. Her name was Cleopatra Eurydice. No, still not that Cleopatra. She was the niece of Philip's general Attalus, the same guy who would lead the shock troops at the outset of the invasion of Persia. At Philip and Cleopatra Eurydice's wedding, or at one of the hard-drinking celebratory parties that followed the wedding, a tipsy Attalus suggested that with a new, fully Macedonian bride, Philip could finally sire a legitimate heir, an heir with pure, royal Macedonian blood. It was an impolitic statement, and Olympias was enraged when Philip didn't immediately speak up on behalf of her talented son, half Epiot though he may have been. In some versions of this story, Philip and Alexander fell out, yelling at each other across the banquet hall. The father drew his sword and charged at his son, but Philip was so drunk, the story goes, that he barely made it a few steps before falling flat on his face. Alexander stood over his drunken father and taunted him. Then, realizing that this was not a great strategy, mother and son left town in a huff and skulked off to live in her home country of Epirus. Olympias' brother, Alexander I, was the king of Epirus, and Olympias grew further miffed when, rather than join his sister in a petty feud with her estranged husband, Alexander I instead teamed up with his brother-in-law Philip to form a marriage alliance. The two kings agreed that Alexander I would marry Philip's daughter, deepening the ties between the royal families. And in case this is confusing, the young Princess Cleopatra, full sister of Alexander of Macedon, was marrying her uncle, Alexander I of Epirus. The alliance did deepen the ties between the two royal houses, and to make sure that he put his own house in order, Philip let it be known that his son Alexander would be welcomed back to court to celebrate the great occasion. The younger Alexander returned for the wedding celebration, while Mom kept herself in seclusion in Epirus. Now, it's possible that the story of the feud between Philip and Alexander is nonsense, told by people who only wanted to make Alexander look better. But either way, Alex came home to celebrate his sister's wedding. By the time the wedding day arrived, the bride was about 18. Her older brother, Alexander, was about 20. But aside from the queen, everyone else was ready to party. For Philip, he had plenty of other wives to be by his side. Macedonia only had one king, but it had quite a few queens. So what if one of them was skulking off in a far-off kingdom? The drinking at the Macedonian court was legendary, and people definitely expected the libations to flow liberally. Philip definitely had a few drinks and was feeling pretty good. As we will see next time, this is where I want to leave him, partying with friends and family, drunk as can be and in high spirits. Oh, and he also happens to be the undisputed ruler of the entire Greek world. Thank you for listening to this episode. I am grateful that you did. Join us on the next one when we say goodbye to the conquering King Philip, watch the rise of his son Alexander, from princeling of the uncouth Macedonians to master of the known world, as he becomes Alexander the Great.